Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War Frontline update for the, 16th of May, I should know, it's my partner's birthday, 16th of May, 2024. And if you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment, pause the screen. So I'm just like this for an inexorably long amount of time. Right, okay. I think that's the wrong word I used there. Okay, let's go to the Frontline update, and I'm not going to go into the Institute for the Study of War American Military Think Tank daily reports. I just need to save a little bit of time on that one. So thanks to JR who's done the mapping update. We're going to go to, obviously, first the northern axis, the border along the Kharkiv, and Belgorod Oblast. We have two areas of Russian attack there. We'll drop into what Syriac Maps, a pro-Russian mapper, says. As you can see, most of the pins, particularly on this more westerly salient, are from Syriac Maps. The other mappers don't necessarily agree with that. The second blue line here is the the Ukrainian defensive line, so everything in between is a grey zone. The Russians are back behind that blue line, as according to Andrew Perpetua. That's the only Ukrainian defensive line we have on a map. All others are Russian defensive lines. Syriac Maps has them increasing territory towards Liptsi there, and having control over Lyoboke and Lukiansi there. So it's Syriac Map says of this on the Kharkiv axis. The Russians continue advancing in the northern dachas of Liptsi. From Chuhiv axis, Russian forces, well, we'll come to that in a second. So that's just a little bit extra from last night there. But as you can see right now, there are some big changes there that aren't mapped on this. And in fact, Syriac Maps did say recently that they're going to struggle with sort of workloading the amount of stuff. They don't just map, or he doesn't just map the Ukraine war. So there are lots of mapping things he does, different conflicts like Gaza, for example. So he's struggling for time, so we might not see some tweets to match up with the mapping as consistently. Nonetheless, as you can see, there's some changes there on the more westerly side next to the water feature, that reservoir there. But also the Russians, so he thinks, have come down much further to the south. That's really quite a big difference between let's take it from Deep State Map to what Syriac Map says. That's over 4 kilometers of difference, and that is a marked difference. Now, we could put it down to mapping timing. It could be that a Deep State might bring out a mapping update later that sees them a lot further to the south, the Russians, but there's certainly a big difference there. And then when we come over to the other side, it's all about Vovchansk. No changes, interestingly, further to the west of this particular salient. And that could suggest, I mean, basically, last few days, we have seen pins all over the place, the length of each of these salients. The fact that that is not the case today, I think, is telling, and probably does support the claim from the Ukrainians that they've generally stemmed the attack, that the Russians' attack has slowed down quite considerably. Let's look at this other salient in the Vovchansk area, that in the Chuhiv axis, Russian forces continue advancing inside Vovchansk, taking control over a series of positions of Vyatsina and Kolokoltsova streets, while other troops advance along the Vovcha River and manage to enter the first houses of the town from the east there. So that would suggest here, and actually it looks like that may have changed as well from last night. So this was 18 hours ago. I don't know that there's any more recent updates, but as mentioned, it looks like there is a difference. Yeah, it's equalized right across there. So the idea is that the Russians have actually gained quite a bit of land, as you can see, inside Vovchansk. Doesn't necessarily accord with what others are saying from the Ukrainian point of view, but there will be a lot of trying to control the narrative here, and that all is not lost in Vovchansk coming from the Ukrainians, and it'll be the opposite from the Russians, which is, yeah, we're marching through Vovchansk unhindered or whatever. They're making good solid advances. The other two mappers, Andrew Perpetua and Deep State Map, have the Russians much further back in terms of what they control. And this comes down to how you define this territory here. So again, as I've said a million times before, Surat maps would assume that every time a Russian sets foot anywhere, it's Russian controlled, and the other mappers are like, no, that's going to be grey zone. They're fighting street to street at the moment. They don't control that. It's not they wouldn't be able to solidly supply those points here with vehicles supplying ammunition and whatnot. So this is going to be dynamic. It's going to be fighting. And they're going to be, both sides are going to be under huge amounts of pressure all around here. It's not Russian controlled. So I would think that certainly Surat maps here is being very much charitable to the Ukrainians and somewhat overzealous. But it's not, to the Russians, but it's not to say that Russians won't take that land, right? Might be in 3 days' time. The same will be, you'd have these other mappers having their lines up here and Surat maps having their forward lines down there. So it just seems to be how each of them map and how they do it differently. Zelensky's described the situation in Kharkiv Oblast as generally controlled despite challenges, with Ukrainian units inflicting losses but needing reinforcement against a new Russian offensive from the north. So that's a pretty predictable statement there from Zelensky. Stanislav Osman, serviceman from the 24th ADAR Battalion, reports that Russian activity on the border with the Sumy region. They are planning something and pulling equipment closer to the border. We are preparing. This is exactly what I was warning of previously, that I'd imagine they're going to push as far as they can there and then hold it. It's going to act as a buffer, and then to stretch the Ukrainians further, the Russians will try and push in the Sumy area from the north here, from Kursk Oblast, or maybe from Belgorod further down in this direction. Who knows exactly where he's talking about, but yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if the Russians push there. Now, there's lots of footage, lots of imagery coming out from Vovchansk. As you can imagine, this is how Vovchansk looks now from above. Says NOAA reports heavy fighting occurs inside the city, smoke plumes and fires everywhere. So we'll have a look at some of these images. So you can see that I'd imagine the Russians are hitting the city with probably multiple launch rockets, artillery, all sorts, fires raging. And there you go. It's not going to be a pleasant place to be at the moment. A few more images. This is from Status 6, that last one we just saw. But a few more. You can see the number of fires raising their ugly heads there. And yeah, it's challenging area. The Ukrainians are obviously trying to defend as much as they can. I'm not really sure of the latest coming from there. I'm under the impression that the Ukrainians are trying to keep a bit of OPSEC going on here. So there might not be as much coming out there as we might be used to in other areas. But nonetheless, there is some movement for the Russians, but mainly according to Surat maps and some Ukrainian claims that they are controlling it a lot more at the moment. Then we come to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk Svatova to Crimea. We have some Russian gains according to Deep State Map and Surat maps in the north of Kuzmivka here, in the Tabaivka area. So that is an area that has ticked up again. So here we have Deep State Maps saying that basically all across that front, the Ukrainians have been pushed back. Surat Map saying the Russians have made a gain in that tree line there. Nothing too, I think, overly significant. So we'll come on down past that area. Oh, actually, there's a little bit more up there as well. It's just north of Kislivka, but that's more sort of in line with what Surat Maps had already said previously. So it might not have been an actual advance in the last 24 hours, but certainly worrying when the Russians are making advances in multiple areas. That said, I think this whole front line has been at least somewhat stable. That area notwithstanding, over the last couple of months, which has allowed the Ukrainians to focus more elsewhere. The Russians might be trying to hold deep battle tactics, which is kind of attack everywhere. But again, I just don't think they have the reserves, the strength in depth to be able to do that in too many places. But nonetheless, there is some activity up there. We'll come past Siversk, where luckily no activity at the moment. And indeed past the Torsko-Terny area, where the Russians have stalled as of late. You can see no changes to the Chaziv Yar sector. Good news for the Ukrainians there. The Russians had made some small gains, or some gains to the west of Ivaniska, beneath this road out of Bakhmut and through Ivaniska. And indeed, a couple of small gains towards Kalinina from Bodanivka, but no changes there. Last 24 hours. And then we come on down to this northern Avdiivka area, and goodness me, we have some gains for the Ukrainians around the southern area of Ocheretina, Solovyovy there. Surat maps saying of this area during the last 32 hours, rather precise amount of hours there, Ukrainian army retook the trenches west of Solovyovy. Meanwhile, Russian combing operations are taking place in Umanska following the Ukrainian withdrawal. That first part, though, is possibly just a few days late from what I think reporting from Ukraine was saying, which is the Russians were being pushed back there with a sort of counterattack from the Ukrainians. I think there's use of Bradleys in the area, possibly. This is where the 47th Brigade, Assault Brigade, is operational, and they have been using Bradleys and Abrams tanks. They've lost a number of each around here, so that's going to be part of the course, right? It's a nutritional nature of an active defence like that. You use mechanized equipment in a war zone, you're going to lose mechanized equipment in a war zone. But they have had some success with those, particularly the Bradleys I've seen do a fairly decent bang-up job there in defending in places. And then that's it. No changes to the rest of the Eastern Front line. That means Krasnoyarivka, Novomikhailivka, Mariinka, all of that fairly stable, at least today. But actually, if you look at it, including Avdiivka in there, then that is a really stable day, all things considered. Going on the southern front line, we have Velika Novosilka, no changes there, which is good news because that's been a little bit active around Uruzhaina and Staromyorsk of the past week or two. And then we come to Robotina, and actually quite a lot to be said about this, or at least there are a number of claims. As you can see from the Surat maps there, we can see that the Russians supposedly control more land, goes back behind Andrew Perpetua's Ukrainian defensive line, and that is a significant difference between the two mappers, and I think there's something that's got to give there. Somebody is definitely wrong. Now, you could say, as I've said earlier, that maybe Andrew Perpetua hasn't mapped recently enough to reflect that Russian attack, but I think there's just a deeper disagreement between the mappers here. There are claims. If we take out the Ukrainian defensive line here, their own defensive line, then the difference between the Russian lines are, as you can see, fairly sizable. Now, there is a bit of an argument about what's going on here. Surat map says that the Russian army took control over the eastern trenches of Robotina. Moreover, the front was leveled in this area following the withdrawal of the Ukrainian army northwards, despite official declarations of the liberation of the locality. So this is it. The Russian MOD claimed that the Ukrainians had ceded the whole of Robotina to Russia, that Russia had taken control of Robotina, but actually Surat map saying despite those claims, it's still necessary to take the northern trenches where Ukrainian troops still remain. So that is basically an agreement, though, that the Russians have taken broadly all of Robotina. Now, there's been some counterclaims to that. No report said last night, that the Russian MOD claims Robotina has been occupied, but this is false. Yet Russians have managed to occupy more areas towards the centre in recent weeks. So you can see the difference there is quite substantial between that and Surat maps. By now, this town has lost all of its strategic value. It's been flattened and is completely undefendable. The value of somewhere like this is that it holds out this whole salient, really, and it stops Kharkiv from being attacked. So it's let's have the fight here. This is the Ukrainian point of view. Let's have the fight here because we don't want to fight up there. But in terms of the town itself, what do you mean by strategic value? That is the operational value of that town, and that you're not holding on to a bunch of rubberized houses on a road that leads nowhere. Leads to Novoprokopivka, which is controlled by the Russians. It has no value in and of itself. The value is in that it stops another place further back from being attacked. So, yeah. But yeah, we come on to another claim here. That means my map's going to go a bit mental. The Russians have had a bad day in Robotina, it says PS01. Wait, they said they control it, and this is the idea that they don't control it because there's lots of imagery of the Russians getting hammered in and around that area. There are basically essentially conflicting reports about the control of the town. It may be that the town ends up being taken by the Russians. As I keep saying, I'm amazed that the Ukrainians have held on to this whole sector really for as long as they have. But I'd say it's probably contested at the moment, and the Russians are having some more success pushing the Ukrainians to the north. But I'd imagine it's still up for grabs at the moment. And that's pretty much that for the whole front line. No news from Kharkiv particularly. But as I said, I haven't checked out the Institute for the Study of War. It's certainly not. I tell you guys on a number of occasions. I think I'm on a roller coaster ride, as is often the case, with how I feel about how things are going. And on the one hand, I think, okay, brilliant. Ukrainians are getting all this equipment coming in from previous aid packages from the US, and they're starting to get things coming through from Europe at the moment, so that's really good. And then the Russians are amassing, well, I'm not sure, and then they've been attacking all on the Eastern Front and been gaining places like Avdiivka. And then I think, oh no, the Ukrainians are attriting the Russians really heavily, so that's really good. And actually it looks like the Russians are really brittle, and then they're partly brittle because they've been amassing forces up here and not sending them to the Eastern Front and equipment. And then the Russians attack up there. I'm like, oh, woe is us. Woe is, not us, but woe is the Ukrainians. They are really taking a bit of a hammering up there in the north, and then it's all down again. And then you're thinking, and actually that's stabilized, and the Russians really haven't moved as far into here as maybe they would like, or some people were worrying about. But are they going to be able to consolidate this area? What are the Ukrainians looking like in terms of being able to push them back out to the border areas? I don't know. I guess we'll have to see. But the fact that they've stabilized and we're yet to see the large part of the last aid package come through, and then the US have said we've got a $2 billion aid package that we're going to expedite, and then you've got Denmark saying today that $750 million aid package, which for Denmark is like phenomenally big, but it's just big anyway. And other countries coming up with some goods that you're thinking, okay, well, what are the Russians looking like for further down the line, for 6 months' time, a year's time? I know the Ukrainians need to mobilize, but they are in the process of doing that, and actually they could throw, if they can train those troops up properly, and if they can get all the assistance for doing that, and maybe even get trainers inside Ukraine for doing that, then I'm starting to feel a little bit more upbeat about the prospects for Ukraine. So it's just this up and down, and then maybe the Russians are hit some energy infrastructure, but then the Ukrainians are hitting with ATACMS in a lot of key places, and then we have the F-16s that are due to come online within a couple of months, possibly even within a month. I'd say probably late July. But you're seeing the shaping of the battlefield taking place with key installations at Zhankoy and at Belbek being taken out. So there's S-400s and S-300 air defense being taken out. So that is air defenses across this swathe of Crimea being taken out in the last week or so. And then you're thinking, well, is that going to allow ATACMS? It's like a bit of a snowball. So then you can send more ATACMS into Crimea because there's less air defense, and they'll have even greater success, less chance of them being shot down. And if there's this fairly decent supply of ATACMS, then, and this is exactly what I've been saying previously, which is Ukraine's strength should be in sitting back and hammering the Russian lines and behind the lines with distance munitions, so as not to attrit their own forces. They need to look after their boots on the ground. If they can use lots of ATACMS and then maybe Storm Shadow and Scout cruise missiles to take out key positions, which will then gather more and more momentum as they degrade the Russian air defenses. They'll be able to have more and more success, and that snowballs till eventually the F-16s are then thrown into the mix, and they have greater success because of the shaping of the air defense scenario. So then I start getting really positive again, and it's just up and down, up and down. But let me know what you think, of course, guys. That is the Frontline update for the 16th of May. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.